Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining in on our webinar today, which will be talking about grant writing. My name is Catherine Caniglio, and I'm the co-chair of the Early Career SIG along with Dr. Annie Haynos. This webinar is the second of two webinars aimed specifically at the early career members of the Academy for Eating Disorders. The first was back in November, and it was about how to build a strong publication record. If you missed it, the recording is still in the Early Career SIG library at aedweb.org. Today's webinar is called Cracking the Code, Strategies for Success in Early Career Grant Writing. We're really excited to be hosting this webinar today because grant writing is a topic that is consistently at the top of the list whenever Annie and I send out surveys to our members inquiring about topics that they'd like additional support and resources on. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All participants are muted with the exception of the panelists and me. The webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes and it is being recorded. So it'll be posted on the AED website in the Early Career SIG library after it concludes for AED members to download and watch at their convenience. In just a few minutes, the presentation will begin, after which the panelists will answer questions from the audience. So please submit your questions anytime during the presentation using the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. It's like in the bottom middle there. And then I'll read the questions when the Q&A portion of the webinar begins. So with us today is Dr. Kendra Becker, who's a clinical psychologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and Dr. Jason Lavender, who is an assistant research scientist in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Becker has received an F32 award from the NIMH as well as an NIH Clinical Research Loan Repayment Award. She's also received several foundational awards, including from the Global Foundation for Eating Disorders and the Harvard Medical School Livingston Fellowship Award. Dr. Lavender has received a K23 Career Development Award from the NIMH, a NARSAD Young Investigator Grant from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and also an NIH Clinical Research Loan Repayment Award. So as you can see, both have been very successful in obtaining the early career grants that so many of us apply for. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Becker.
All right, thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to start off by just giving a couple of pointers about just grant writing in general. Jason and I put our heads together and thought that these are things that are relevant no matter if you're applying for an F32 or a K23 or really kind of any NIMH grant, and I would venture to say any grant at all. So we think these are just important things to keep in mind. So the first one seems really obvious, but I think it's really important to say, which is that every institution and mentorship team is going to vary. So that means really talking with who you're planning to submit a grant with is really important, and keeping open communication throughout the process is key to getting a successful grant. And talk to as many people as you can. Talk to people outside your team, within your team, get to understand how they were successful in getting grant funding. So, you're already doing this by participating in this webinar, but really start communication as soon as possible. And that's going to be a theme you'll notice throughout this presentation is do things early. So speaking of early, what is the first thing you need to do? Well, this almost, again, seems like for many people it won't even be necessary to consider, but it is worth checking to make sure that your institution is actually registered with the NIMH, because an institution has to have an agreement or registration with NIMH to accept an award. So if you won the award, they have to be able to say that they've agreed to the certain guidelines that NIMH poses to institutions. So you need to make sure that's set up. If it's not, it's going to take at least a month to get it going. So you want to make sure and plan that ahead to make sure you understand if that's been done. You also need to set up an ERA Commons account for any NIMH award, and this includes a loan repayment awards as well. But this is how you're going to link your application together. It's how you're also going to be able to track your scores, how your letter writers are going to be able to submit letters on your behalf. So it's really important that you get this underway as soon as possible. It as well can take between 2 to 3 weeks. So you want to make sure and just plan in advance for that. You're not going to be able to submit an application without it. The next thing that we think is important to just be thinking about is getting to know who are your support staff. Knowing who's in your grants office, who's going to be able to help you submit this application. They're an invaluable resource that can help you understand what some of the documents are, what the language means. Sometimes it's really difficult to understand when we have the instructions what's being asked of you, and they can really help you understand that language. They can also help you set up a timeline that's going to be mindful of any institutional internal deadlines. So for example, MGH requires that you have your full application in 10 days before the NIMH application deadline, and that's in order to help make sure that everything is correct. All your margins are correct, that there's nothing that's over the page limit, that you have all the documents that you're required to have. So it's really protective to make sure that your application is going to go in and be read. So it's really important to get to know that stuff as soon as possible as well. And then just to learn about any other unique policies that or requirements that might be relevant for your department. Another thing to do when you're getting, just starting to think about submitting to any NIH institution is knowing what are the priorities, strategic plan of the institution that you're considering applying for. So NIMH, or the National Institute of Mental Health, is only one institute of NIH. There's several. There's, for example, I've known people who have submitted to the NIDDK, which is the National Institute of Diabetes and Kidney Disease. There's the NIDA, which is the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So you want to know which type of institution you might be applying for, and start to think about, where would your application best fit. I'm going to be talking mostly about the NIMH because that's the one that I am most familiar with, but there are other options where applications could be good fit. So make sure you explore those with your mentor. But when you're thinking about what proposal you want to put in, you do want to be checking out the specific institute's page. What are the things that they're funding? What are they saying is their mission statement? What are the things that they think are really going to be moving that particular institute forward? Because each institute has different priorities and objectives. So if you'll look at this example really quickly, you can see the mission statement for NIMH has the mission that they're to transform the understanding and treatment of mental illnesses through basic and clinical research, paving the way for prevention, recovery, and cure. And then they give you 4 objectives that they're specifically interested in funding. And if you go into those, if you go to this web link that's at the bottom, you'll see that there's even more information about what are the specific priorities within those objectives. And you can really aim your proposal directly towards some of those. So for example, there are, I think in the first one, define the mechanisms of complex disorders. A specific priority would be describe the molecules, cells, and neural circuits associated with complex behavior. So if you're interested in neural circuitry, you would want to highlight to any reviewer that this is how your proposal fits into understanding mental health and fits into the mission statement of the NIMH. So you really want to highlight that, be thinking about highlighting that in your proposal and how you can propose a project that's going to fit within those aims, because they won't fund things that don't fit with their mission statement. And the next really important thing to do when you're, again, just getting started is to identify who your program officer would be. Now, this is, again, going to be specific to the institute you're applying to, but it's really important that you talk to them as early as possible when you have your idea, when you first start to have even a draft, an early draft of your specific aims, which I'll talk about in a bit. You'll really want to be reaching out to this person. You want them to know you, to know the work that you're proposing to do, and so that they can lobby for you, but also so that they can help you as you're drafting some of these documents and get feedback from them. Another thing that the program officer can assist you in is just thinking about what are points that reviewers constantly bring up in study sections, what are things you would want to avoid, is your project actually fitting within the mission statement? They can give you that feedback early on, or is there a way that you could tweak it so that it would better fit? So it's extremely helpful to contact them and to be in contact with them throughout the process of applying. Here is an example. The website, or the web link at the bottom, shows you a link to get to the list of people who are program officers. I put this page up because it identifies 2 people who I know have been supporters of applications in eating disorders, one for adults and one for adolescents and children. So what are the most important takeaway points for today, even before I get started with the F32 specifically? Is start as early as possible. I really can't stress that enough, because you're going to be needing a lot of help from a lot of people, and so you want to be starting as quickly as possible so that you're not rushing anyone. Communicate with your program officer, again, as early as possible, and use them throughout the application process. Talk to as many people as you can, and get as much information and feedback as you can. And get lots of examples of other successful applications. If you can, get summary statements from people who've applied, which is the feedback that people get from reviewers after they've submitted a grant application, so that you can see, how are people writing things, how are they talking about the methods, how are they talking about the patient populations that maybe you would be interested in, and specifically, if you can, get examples from your own institution, best if it's from your own lab, but certainly from your own institution, because a lot of the information about facilities and resources is going to be stuff that's going to be similar. If you're applying, for example, across MGH, they have some of the same facilities that you can put in your grant. That will make you seem like an attractive candidate. All right, so I'm going to start going ahead into talking about is an F32 grant the right grant for you? So I'm just going to jump right in and start talking about what it looks like to apply for an F32. And I think it's probably worth mentioning that I don't work for NIMH, but this is what these are some of the tips that I used to be successful in getting this grant. It was my first ever grant application, so if I can do it, I think everyone can. So I'll just go ahead and get thinking about what is an F32 award. So what does it mean? It's a National Research Service Award. It's for individual postdoctoral fellowship. So this is really giving you money to do a mentored postdoctoral training project. So if you look at this kind of graph of the different types of grants that you can apply for, we're really talking about postdoctoral grants. There are NRSAs that are for predoctoral applicants, but I'm not talking about that today. I'm only talking about the postdoctoral grants. If you're thinking about applying for an F32 award, it's important to know that it is an award with a payback period. So what that means is if you were to be awarded an F32, you would spend the first 12 months accruing a payback obligation. And then the next 12 months, you would be paying off that obligation. So all of the awards are at least 2 years long to allow you to pay back that obligation, but they can be up to 3 years long, depending on what your training plan and project and goals are. What is the purpose of an F32? Well, specifically, the purpose, and I'm reading a quote here, is to enhance the research training of promising postdoctoral candidates who have the potential to become productive independent investigators in scientific health-related research fields relevant to the missions of the participating NIH institutes and centers. So again, they're already highlighting in what the purpose of this award is that it fits within the mission statements of whatever NIH institute you're applying to. So again, it's super important that you go back and think about what is the mission statement of the institute that you're applying to. But also within this is the idea that you're already a promising candidate. So they really want to be promoting people who've already demonstrated that they're interested in research and capable of doing it. So they're looking for rising stars who have the potential to become independent scientists if they have training that is in their chosen field of study that will kind of advance them towards becoming an independent scientist or clinical scientist. It's really important that you actually state that in your proposal, that for the F32, what you're hoping to do is to become more independent in your research. So independent researcher, independent clinical scientist in whatever field of study that you're proposing to do. And you might be wondering, well, do I want a K award or do I want to apply for an F32 award? And I know that I faced this question when I was first thinking about applying. So the first piece of advice I can give is, again, talk to as many people as possible about their experiences, and specifically talk to your mentor. For me, the decision boiled down to the fact that I wanted to be integrating a lot of new methodologies into my research. So I wanted to be integrating neuroimaging and endocrinology into the work that I was doing. And I felt that, well, my training team felt that it would be really helpful for me to have a foundational level of knowledge before trying to propose an additional project on top of something else. So that's really important when thinking about the difference between the F32 and the K awards. And I'll talk more about this, but you don't get specific project funding for the F32. So what that means is when you're thinking about which one do you want to do, the F32 is best if it's leveraged off of an ongoing project in your lab. So again, I chose the F32 because I felt like it would be the best way for me to get some introductory level training and methods I wanted to do without also trying to manage my own study at the same time. So I went for the F32. So here's some websites that can help you get started when you're thinking about applying for an F32. This first one will show this page, and it will give you some links to just funding opportunities for postdoctoral fellows, period. And you'll see the first one listed is the F32. If you were to click on that F32 link, you would see that there are examples of people who've already been funded. So you can get that information already. If you click on the National Service Award announcement, you'll go straight to the funding announcement. And this is a really important page for you to visit as you're starting to think about applying. You'll see that it'll give you just the eligibility requirements that I'll go over briefly, but it will also give you information about what does the salary look like, what's the budget, what are any updates to requirements for documents. And so you always want to make sure that you're looking at the most recent version of this PA announcement. And you can kind of see, if you were to look at this slide, you'll see that they'll show you if there's been any updates, and you want to make sure you're looking at the most updated version. And I mentioned the instructions earlier, and the instruction book PDF will look, it always have something like this on the cover, but it will describe in detail what you need to do to apply. It'll tell you everything about what needs to be in your documents, how links to page requirements, how to fill out the different forms. It'll give you all of that information. So read that first and really familiarize yourself with what you need to do. But also be mindful that there might be updates in the funding announcement. So make sure you're looking at both to make sure that your documents are covering everything that's being asked of you. So are you eligible? For the F32, you have to be a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, lawful, permanent resident. You also have to have a professional degree by the time that you would receive the award. And that can be an MD, a PhD, a PsyD, a DBM, etc. You just have to make sure that you have that by the time that you would be awarded the grant. You have to show evidence of academic performance in science and a commitment to research. And yes, that includes publications, but it also includes coursework. So for the F32, similarly to predoctoral grants, you're going to be submitting your grades in particular courses. So they want to see that you've been dedicated to science and to the pursuit of knowledge, and that you have had academic success for a long-standing period of time. You have to be able to devote 100% effort to the project. And your mentor is going to also have to write in their letter of support for you that they can give you that 100% effort to work on this project. It's really important for people who are in clinical positions that they are putting in their training program whatever clinical work they plan on doing. So any part of your clinical duties have to be described in your research training program. Again, so that you're not doing, 80% this research project and then 20% clinical. Nope, everything has to be 100% effort on the F32. And clinical trials are not allowed for an F32. You can get training in aspects of running a clinical trial, but your specific project cannot be a clinical trial. Are you ready to apply? Most importantly, you have to have a sponsor, and the sponsor needs to be somebody who is not only willing to train you, but is also active in the area that you're proposing to pursue. So by active, they mean they need to be publishing. Ideally, they would already have funding in this area, and they would be not just committed to mentoring you, but be able to demonstrate that they're committed to mentoring by being able to provide a report on who they've mentored in a similar fashion. So successful track records of other mentees getting funding, getting research positions, moving into independent research careers is what would look best from your sponsor. You also want to be able to document in various different forms that they have sufficient funds, time, resources to be able to help you complete the project and to be able to train you in doing the project. So that would mean that, if you're proposing imaging, there has to be a way for you to have access to the scanner. If you're proposing that you're going to learn statistical methods, there has to be a way for, there has to be software that you have access to. There has to be funds for you to be able to recruit participants, etc. There has to be enough structure in place for you to be able to do the project, and the mentor has to document that. And they also have to document that you can take the time to do the training, aims, the courses, workshops, etc. And if your mentor has some of these, but not all of these, or maybe perhaps your mentor or selected primary sponsor does have all of these things, but they're not an expert in a specific methodology or statistical technique that you want to learn how to do, you should consider co-sponsors. And this would be someone else who's also mentoring you and learning either methodology, helping support your project, helping you develop a new statistical skill set. Whatever the case, you have to justify why you need more than one sponsor, but it's not looked down upon to have multiple sponsors. And in fact, if you're proposing different types of projects, adding in new things into your research program, it would make sense to have more than one sponsor. I said this already, but it's worth mentioning and underlining, it does not provide project funds, which means when you're thinking about the F32, another way to decide if you're ready is, does your lab, does your sponsor, does your co-sponsor have a project that you can leverage? Do they have participants already coming in that you can maybe add a specific task to? Can you analyze the data differently? Can you analyze a particular part of the data that nobody's looking at yet? Whatever it is, can you leverage a project that's already ongoing, because you will not be getting funds from the F32 to do the project. Now, if someone does have a sponsor that has additional funds to fund a separate project, that would also work, but it's just worth keeping in mind that then you still have to complete the project within the 2 to 3 year timeline. So what I ended up doing was leveraging a project that was already ongoing in the lab and proposing to analyze some of the data that was being collected but not being utilized in the same way that I thought would be interesting. Similarly to your sponsor, your institution also has to demonstrate that they have the resources in place to support you. Again, that there's facilities, that there's so things would be like postdoctoral seminars, how to move into early careers, those types of things would be programs that you would want to highlight in your grant that basically show that your institution cares about you moving from a postdoc to an independent researcher, and that there's facilities and resources available for you to do your training. And the last thing to do is think about dates. So it takes a long time for these things to get funded. So if you apply, just be aware that if you're thinking about getting your parts of your training paid for, when you need to apply in order to make sure that there wasn't a gap in your funding. And so looking at the dates and being really thoughtful about that. And then also just keeping in mind that even this chart is optimistic sometimes. So I applied in December 8th, and I was awarded first time, so I didn't have to resubmit, and I did not get my funding in July. I didn't get it until September. So just really being thoughtful about, how long it might take for you to be able to start your funding. And in general, if you have to revise, it's going to take a little bit longer. So just keep that in mind as you're planning out when you would want to submit. Again, going back to our earlier comment about planning as early as possible. So there's a lot of different supplements that are involved in submitting an F32. Some of these are going to be similar to the K, so I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm just going to suggest that you, again, look at the instructions and figure out what's required for each particular document. And note that if some of the ones with stars are things that, again, if you're using an application from your same institute or from your same lab, there's probably a lot of material that you can copy and paste. There are things that are already being, if you're using a study, if you're leveraging a study, for example, you can copy and paste a lot of this stuff because it's being done already in the larger parent. So just to, again, make use of things that have already been done. You don't need to reinvent the wheel if there are parts of your application that are going to be similar across your institution. For example, at MGH, the Responsible Conduct of Research, they actually have a PDF of what they would like all applicants to be saying that they'll be doing, because it's a required program at MGH if you were awarded any fellowship or career development grant. This is a chart that we got from our grants office, and I think it's really helpful. You don't have to do something exactly like this, but I thought it was really helpful in organizing the documents and making sure that I had all of the documents I needed, and also making sure that I was aware of the timeline for each document. So the way that I did this was to put all of the different supplements into this spreadsheet, put it on Dropbox, and then share it with the people who were helping me compose the documents, so that I could be getting updates on where it was, when it was time for me to revise it, what version we were on, which versions needed to go to research management or the internal deadline, and also just some helpful information about page limits, line limits, etc. That can be really helpful when you have you're trying to keep so much information. This is a nice way to summarize it all. So I'm really going to quickly go through, because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for Jason to talk about the K, but I'm going to quickly just discuss a little bit of the order that I would do some of the really important documents. So these are scored documents. Not all documents are scored. Some of the supplements are just deemed to be adequate or not. They're all important, but some of them actually get specific scores. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these documents in the order that I do them that I think is efficient. So the specific aims is kind of the advertisement for your study. You're selling yourself, your project, why you're the person to do this study, why this study is so important, why it needs to be done, and you're doing it all in one page. So it's a document that requires a lot of revision and a lot of time. So it's hard to write. So I would start with it first. It also helps organize your thoughts for the rest of the project. A strategy for how to approach this is to start with the public health relevance of why your project is necessary to do. Start with why it would be horrible if the study wasn't funded. You really want your reviewer to be feeling guilty that this hasn't already been done. You want them to be grabbed and think this is so important that it needs to be funded now. And then be thinking about briefly can you describe about the current state of the literature? What gaps are there? How is your project going to address that gap? Why it's important to address that gap? What's the main hypothesis you're testing? And then very brief methods. So as in how many people, what type of studies, a cross-sectional, longitudinal, throw in important words like that it's innovative and that you're going to be using different types of methods if you are, but really briefly say what the methods are, and then your specific hypotheses, and using strong words to say, we are going to determine the emotional functioning of people with eating disorders, or whatever it is that you're actually studying, but use strong words. Once you have a draft, even if it's not one page, even if it's not fully formed, send it to the program officer to start to get ideas about if it fits within their mission statement and if it's something that they think would be fundable. Letters, also want to start this as soon as possible. You're going to want to ask people to write you support letters, and you really want these letters to be as positive as possible. And a lot of times you're going to be writing the letters yourself, so it's important to be thinking about giving yourself time to do that, but also thinking about that you want each letter to be really positive, but that if you're going to write them yourself, they also have to sound like they came from different people. So be giving yourself some time to think about what you would like those letters to say. Good recommendation letters come from people like past graduate student or past graduate school mentors, the directors of clinical training, people who know you but are not part of this project. They can't be part of this project to be a referee letter. Support letters come from collaborators, contributors, and consultants. You also want to ask them early to be part of your project. The difference from recommendation letters is they're going to be saying how strong your training plan and project idea is and what it is that they're specifically contributing to your project. What's their role? Are they going to be providing specific specific statistics training? Are they going to be providing you with a specific knowledge about a method, access to a different patient population, whatever the case may be? They're going to need to describe how they're contributing to your project. BioSketch is when you're going to sell yourself as someone who can do this work. The link there will give you the link, will open up a specific page for fellowship grants. They have a slightly different BioSketch format that includes the courses that you'll need to highlight and your grades in those. I would say the most important thing here is just to identify in the personal statement or section A why you're the person to do this study, and really highlight, again, kind of sell yourself, your previous work, how it leads you up to be applying for this particular proposal. You can have 5 contributions to science with 4 citations each. I'd like to make one of those contributions relevant to the project that I'm proposing to you. Really quickly, the research strategy and training plan need to flow from the specific aims. Your research strategy is an elongated version of why this is important, what's the significance of your project. The approach is really your methods, your data collection plan, your data analysis plan. The analysis plan needs to be pretty specific, so start early with that too. Once you have your specific aims, be contacting the statistician who's going to be helping you plan out those statistics. So you know your power, how many people you need, etc. Preliminary data for an F32 doesn't have to be exactly the project. You don't have to have already done the project. It just needs to be demonstrating that you have some skill sets. Maybe you already know how to do certain methods. Maybe someone in your lab has already looked at something similar, and so you can say that there's evidence that your hypotheses will be correct. Or maybe you just need to show that you can recruit the population. But it doesn't need to be groundbreaking preliminary data, so don't let that hold you up from submitting. And then your goals for fellowship training need to be really tightly linked to your project. And they have to be fairly specific. So just briefly, here's a chart that shows you about what they're looking for, you know, how long, how often, which years, and what courses are you going to take, and how each one of the things that you're proposing fits in with one of your overarching career goals, again, which should be to become an independent researcher in whatever field it is that you're currently working in. You'll also have to identify in the F32 what percentage of time you're spending on each one of these different kind of activities like coursework, workshops, meetings, etc. And as you'll see in this example, I put that there will be patient care so that I can continue to work towards getting licensed. Again, because you have 100% effort, so you have to use that. All right, so do the doable, meaning don't propose a project you can't do. Use reference software, and always keep the reader in mind. Make sure that somebody who's not in your area of research can understand your proposal. Keep formatting requirements and page numbers in mind as well. And always give yourself extra time to submit, so submit early. Here are some additional websites, and I'm going to pass it over to Jason now.
Okay, thank you, Kendra. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the second part of the presentation today. And whereas Kendra was focused primarily on the F32 mechanism, I'll be focusing on sort of the next step in the sort of early career grant stage, and talking about Mentored Career Development Awards, or K Awards. Apology. There we go. So one thing I want to preface before I jump right into the information is that as Kendra and I were putting this together, we realized that, not surprisingly, there's a fair bit of overlap in concepts or in topics or in suggestions that we both had in terms of approaching both the F and the K. So I've done my best to sort of minimize overlap, but you will hear a few things sort of reiterated for the K, similar to what Kendra said with the F. To begin, the with the K, there are really two sorts of types of Ks that people can apply to. There's the K23 and the KO1. If you look in the eating disorders field, the majority of grants, K awards that have been funded have been K23s, and these are mentored patient-oriented research career development awards. The purpose is similar for both. For the K23, it's supporting the career development of individuals with a clinical doctoral degree who are committed to pursuing patient-oriented research. So that's the major distinction between the K23 and the KO1 is that you have to have a clinical degree to apply for the K23 mechanism. So this would be an MD, for example, or as is common, a clinical psychology PhD. Other PhDs that are not clinical PhDs would typically be more likely to apply for the KO1. And the KO1, again, very similar, provides support and protected time for intensive supervised career development experience in biomedical, behavioral, or clinical sciences leading to research independence. So there's definitely more similarities than dissimilarities across the two. I will be focusing mostly on K23s because that's what my experience has been and what I received. But for those who do not have a clinical degree or may be considering a KO1 instead of a K23, there's a lot of information available online to understand further differences. And I'll talk about a few other differences in these next few slides. So the major characteristics of the K, and this is where you'll begin to see some of the differences between the F32 and the K23. For the K, you have to devote a minimum of 75% of your full-time professional effort. You can devote up to 100% if that is feasible in your position and if that's what you choose to apply for, but the minimum is 75%. So it's important to consider the position that you're in and whether or not the position would actually allow you to devote that 75% because that is a basic eligibility criterion. Generally, Ks are 4 to 5 years in duration. The typical duration that's listed on the website says 4 years, but in my experience, both for myself and for a number of other people in the eating disorder field who've received them, it's not uncommon to apply for 5 years just in order to get the training and complete the research within that time frame. And the K does include, similar to the F, both career development and training components as well as specific research activities. This table is actually from one of the many very useful websites for this is, I believe, NIMH. And as you can see, for both the KO1 and K23, much more similar than dissimilar, just a slight difference in the salary cap between the KO1 and the K23. And the research costs for both are similar. So this would be research costs at $50,000. And then, again, the typical duration listed as 4, but if you can justify 5, it's not uncommon for them to accept that. So a few early questions that I sort of thought about and that I began to think about when I started originally talking to my program officer and other people who had applied for Ks is, when are you going to apply? There are different sort of time periods where a person might apply. One option is to apply while you're on your postdoc. And I think Kendra alluded to this a little bit in her experience of whether to apply for a K or an F32. And so some people will apply on their postdoc, and the K23 will sort of be the beginning of their transition into their first sort of academic position. Other people will, for various reasons, will seek out their first position and then will apply for a K while they're in that position as an assistant professor. And there are a number of considerations for sort of deciding between these two things. Probably the most important consideration is whether or not your CV, your bio sketch is advanced enough. And this is something that my program officer and I discussed at length when I was originally applying, to remember the types of people that you're competing against when you're applying for a K, some of which may be assistant professors professors. So if you're still a postdoc, then you might not be quite as advanced in terms of number of publications, awards, and things of that nature. But many people do apply during their postdoc, and many people can be successful in getting Ks during that time period. So it really depends on the individual's sort of development at that stage, as well as Kendra noted earlier, sort of the extent to which additional training or additional experiences may be necessary to sort of bolster the CV or biosketch to maybe be more competitive for a K at a later time, if it doesn't make sense at the present time. Another early question, which Kendra mentioned earlier, is what you want to do consistent with funding priorities, both what you're proposing within the grant and also what you're proposing sort of to do as in your academic career, because the idea is that they want to fund Ks to support people in becoming independent researchers who will continue to do research in the long term that is consistent with that institute's priorities. Another is what you actually want to do feasible given the mechanism limitations. And one of Kendra's last points was do the doable. And that's probably another theme that is true of these career development grants, is that one of the consistent types of feedback that I've heard both in my own experience and in others is that applicants tend to initially propose or initially consider doing too much. And the idea being that reviewers will recognize this because they're experienced and they're savvy, and they will comment on the fact that sometimes it's too much for this particular mechanism. And that brings me to the next point, which is if you're not considering a K, another option is to go straight into an R series grant. And many people do this and select this option. So something that you want to consider, and again, this is a great time to discuss it with colleagues, mentors, program officers, all of these different individuals who have great insights, and decide whether you really do need additional training and support through a career development award, or whether it would make sense to go straight into an R series grant, maybe an R03, an R21, maybe if you've got good pilot data and you've got support from colleagues, maybe straight into an R01, depending on where you're at. But again, these R series grants, you don't have to do the K23 or the KO1 route prior to an R series grant. With regards to eligibility, if you have had an R01, you're no longer eligible for a K, but smaller R series grants would not make you ineligible for a K, and that's another thing to keep in mind. Yes, so, and do you really need more training in career development? And importantly, can this be justified? Because reviewers will also comment on that. If they feel that you're able to do the research that you want to do and you don't need additional training, then they will comment on that and that will work against you. Just some basic data on K funding, and I've included the website for this because this is just a very small snippet. And this just shows for the last couple of years, this is across all of NIH, so not specific to any given institute. But you can see the number of applications for the past couple of years for both a KO1 and a K23. You can see the number of awards, and then just the success rate, so basically the percentage that were funded ultimately. And you can see that the success rates are fairly good for an NIH grant, so about 30 to 40% between the KO1s and the K23s. And you can also see that over the past few years, it's been fairly consistent. There's been some up and down fluctuation, but around 1/3 approximately have been funded. So something to keep in mind, and you can always go to this website and explore in more detail if you're interested. So the first steps for the K that I'll share are similar to some of the steps that Kendra mentioned for the F. So you want to find the right program announcement and review it carefully. Unlike the F32 that Kendra was mentioning, K23s do allow for clinical trials. So when you're looking, there are sort of two main K23 PAs, one that allows for clinical trials and one that does not. And then there are also separate program announcements for KO1s. So I've just shown one here. This would be the parent announcement for the K23 independent clinical trial not allowed. But so you need to decide sort of whether you're going to do a clinical trial or not, and then locate the appropriate PA as the starting point. Something I highly recommend too that I have found useful is looking at the NIH Reporter and looking at currently funded grants and looking at basically all of the information that's available on the Reporter for the grants. So this is just a screenshot of a search that I did recently, and this just shows a lot of the eating disorder oriented funded K awards that are currently funded for this fiscal year. And if you click on the project title, you can get more information. So you can get information on what study section the grant went to. You can get information on the program officer that had that was handling it. So it's very useful. And then you can also see the abstract and see what the person proposed, usually what their training goals are, what the research is. And it's just really useful information to understand from a given institute, in this case, looking at NIMH, what are the types of K awards that NIMH is funding? And that can help guide you early on in the process in terms of your thinking about what training and what research activities you might want to propose if you proceed. And then again, I'm reiterating it because I think it's probably the most important experience is talk to lots of people, talk to your program officer as much as you can. Get used to talking to your program officer. So I will be the first to admit that that made me nervous when I was first applying. But it's very common for program officers to prefer to speak on the phone rather than exchange emails about questions and things of that nature. So get ready to do that if you haven't had experience with that before. And they're going to be just an exceptionally helpful resource throughout the process. Definitely talk to K recipients in the field and those at your institution. Those in the field can sort of help guide you in terms of the experience with sort of eating disorder related career development awards, and then those at your institution can give you guidance about how those awards sort of play out actually within your department or at your institution. And then of course talk to your mentors and colleagues. You do want to plan out your timeline. Kendra mentioned this for Fs as well. The important dates are here. So for new K submission deadlines, you've got February 12th, June 12th, and October 12th. And then you can see the approximate dates of the review and the council that would correspond to those submission dates. You always want to assume or at least consider the possibility that there'll need to be a resubmission. Not always. Some of these get funded on the first round, but often it does require a resubmission. And so, of course, that pushes the deadline back as well for when a grant might be funded ultimately. So you just want to be very considerate of the timeline when you're doing your planning, and also consider a timeline that does include a possible resubmission. And again, there are so many documents that you're going to end up needing from other people for the K as well. Statements of support and training, reference letters, institutional commitment letters. So you just want to give all of these individuals plenty of time. Ongoing steps as you're proceeding with your application is to remain in regular contact with the program officer. Definitely share drafts of the specific aims of the research strategy, whatever the program officer feels would be useful, and if they have time, definitely check with them. They're there to help you with this process, and they're generally very, very willing to consider these requests to review different elements of the grant because they want, they want you to be successful as well. Getting feedback from people, especially people who haven't been looking at multiple drafts, because often fresh eyes will catch issues that other people who've been looking at it more frequently won't. It's also important to sort of plan for alternatives. If your K doesn't ultimately get funded, that doesn't mean that you can't be seeking funding elsewhere, either simultaneously or have something else in mind. And these can be foundation grants. Many institutions will have internal Ks that are a little bit shorter. The idea being that ultimately it would hopefully get you some pilot data or some additional experience that would make you competitive either for an R-Series grant or perhaps a full NIH K. And then also if sort of you're in a situation where your position may be somewhat dependent on getting a K or a high level of funding, then considering alternatives like going on the job market and seeking other positions. So just in terms of the scored review criteria, I think these are important to keep in mind. They're going to be scoring a grant based on the candidate, so based on you. They're going to be doing it based on the career development plan and goals, the research plan, the mentorship team, and then the environment and the institutional commitment. So the candidate information is really focused on sort of your background and proving the background that you've got, how that shows that you're committed to research, that you're committed to becoming an independent investigator moving forward. What are the experiences and education, training, and research that you've had in the past that will support that moving forward? And then what are the goals and the specific training plan that you have in mind for this K? How are you going to use the funding and the time from this award to advance yourself to a point where you will be a successful independent investigator? And that this is where it's really key to highlight why this grant is necessary for you to become an independent investigator. So it's a careful balance between showing how successful you've been up to this point, but why you need additional training in order to continue to be successful in terms of becoming an independent investigator. The second sort of major components are the mentorship team and the letters and the statements and the different components from those individuals. And in that area, really what they're looking for is a strong mentorship team, and typically they want mentors who have had, or even better, have active NIH funding. They want individuals who've had a history of mentoring, and particularly mentoring individuals who've been successful. And they also want individuals who can commit to being available to provide the training and support that's necessary in the role as a mentor, co-mentor, et cetera. The institutional environment and commitment, that is basically focused on, is this institution the right place for you to be doing this work? And is the institution committed to you? And so one of the big things that comes up with K awards is basically the concept that the institution needs to essentially within their letter commit that your job is there, whether or not you get this grant, and that can or cannot be a complicated issue depending on the particular department and depending on the individual's particular situation. So that's something to be very aware of and to definitely discuss with people who've been through that process, and to discuss with your mentors and other individuals within your department. And then finally, the reference letters, similar to F32 that Kendra was mentioning. You want these to be people who can speak very highly to you. It's great if they're sort of senior researchers in their field. They wouldn't have any involvement directly in the K23, but perhaps are past mentors or individuals or colleagues that you have worked closely with in the past. And these are submitted independent of the grant. They're submitted directly to ERA Commons, and you won't see these. Unlike the other elements of the grant. And then finally, the research plan. I won't go into this in great detail because it's very similar to what Kendra was speaking about with the F, but certainly you'll have your specific aims, your background, significance, innovation, things of that nature. Really, the one thing I wanted to highlight here was to keep the research feasible. And that, again, is something that seems to constantly come up from program officers and reviewers who don't want you to propose a research study that is something that you're not going to be able to complete within the limited time frame that you have. Just keeping an eye out on the time, I'm just going to do this very, very quickly. So consider the study section that you want to request. And again, this is great to look at the reporter and also talk to your program officer. And then I have some information here about the review process, just keeping in mind sort of what that's like. And I think this is always helpful to keep in mind as you're writing your grant in terms of what the person's sort of mental state, what the reviewer's mental state is going to be when they're actually looking at these grants. And then I'll leave this off with here with some useful websites for these, for the NIH grants in general and also Ks, and go ahead and turn it back over to Catherine for Q&A.
Great. So thanks, Dr. Becker and Dr. Lavender. That was very informative. And I just want to remind everyone, too, that the slides will be posted. So if there's any links that you didn't get a chance to see or any slides that you wanted to kind of review again, it'll be posted on the Early Career SIG library, and you can pause it and kind of go at your own pace. I also wanted to mention, too, before we just get into the Q&A, that the Early Career SIG has put together a directory available on the Early Career site on AED Web, where members have listed grants that they've applied for and received, which can be helpful since both Dr. Becker and Lavender have talked about, the importance of reaching out to people. So that can be helpful to identify AED members that you could reach out to for advice, or perhaps that they'd maybe be willing to share examples, things like that. So if you go to the Early Career site and then you go to the Discussions tab, you'll see a thread called Collaboration Directory, and that's where that is. So I've tried my best to consolidate the questions into one that kind of gets at a few topics. So I'll give you each maybe like a minute and a half to respond. So I know we end at 6. Or 6 Eastern rather. So the question is, what do reviewers look for when clinical psychologist applicants attempt to show evidence of a commitment to research career? And so thinking about how you fit clinical work into this, and do the reviewers know that you're saying that you're 100% research, but you're also kind of doing clinical work, or did you truly feel like you really had to put clinical work on hold during the funding period? So this may be, I'll let whoever would like to go first can take it.
Well, I can go first from the F32 perspective, because I'm wondering if there's some question about that 100% effort piece.
Yeah, I think that's what they're referring to.
Yeah, so to answer it from the F32 perspective, you do not have to put your clinical work on hold. I did not do that, nor did I pretend that I was going to, which is why in my table that I provided a demonstration of, I listed that I would be doing 10% clinical work as part of my training plan. So it was folded into my training plan, which is what you need to do for the F32. I can let Jason speak about the K award, but it's not 100% effort. So that's kind of a big distinction between the two.
Yeah, and with the K23, there's obviously more flexibility because you only have that 75% minimum. So, it is recommended in that sort of background candidate section that you would, if you're not doing 100% on the K, that you would indicate sort of what the other 25% or 15%, however much you're not using, what you're going to be spending that time doing. And typically the hope is that that is further career development or further at least activities consistent with an academic career, be it, clinical towards licensure or teaching or things of that nature. So I think there's a little more flexibility in the K, but if you do something less than 100%, then you just want to be clear about sort of what the additional percentage getting you up to 100%, what those activities are going to be, and ideally present it in a way that is consistent with your ongoing career development, broadly speaking.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. This one's a quick one. If you could each speak to, you both alluded to the importance of reaching out to program officers early. So the question is, how early is too early, and when did you each reach out to your program officers when you were writing the grants that you each presented on? So maybe Kendra, you want to go first again?
Oh, sure. So I kind of feel like I'm having a hard time thinking about what would have been way too early. I think if you have an idea and you have some thoughts about what you're going to do, even if what your specific aims is a paragraph, I don't think it's a bad idea to at least start thinking with your program officer if that's within the priorities of the institute you're applying to. I spoke to Dr. Chavez pretty early for the F-32. I did not have a specific aims fully drafted or anything, just to get an idea if it made sense and if it was fundable. And if it was, what size of a project was appropriate for an F-32. And then, like Jason said, continuing up that conversation as I was, fleshing out the project more. So yeah, I would say pretty early, honestly.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate that it's been quite a number of years now for me, but I want to say it was like 9 months to a year before I submitted it. And as part of my conversation, that also helped me decide when I was going to submit the grant. And as I recall, I believe I decided to submit in the fall rather than in June in order to get further to get a few things done that would support my application. I would also definitely reiterate, it's probably clear to everyone, but have these in-depth conversations with your mentor before you reach out to the program officer. And it's not uncommon for calls to be with, you might have calls with the program officer and your mentors all together. That can be helpful as well. So definitely have a good sense of your mentors and your mentorship team and what their thoughts are before reaching out to the program officer. I think that'll be useful. But yeah, I think I'm sure there is such a thing as too early, but like 9 months to a year to get those basic conversations early on, I think is definitely reasonable. So reasonable. So I definitely agree with Kendra on that point.
Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you to our panelists and to AED. And so, like I mentioned, this will be available for you to view again. And yeah, thank you to Drs. Becker and Lavender, and thanks to everyone who's attended.